couple days.
Thank you for reminding me to record.
Fantastic. So any folks watching this recording online just missed the first couple minutes of my spiel. This is the fourth session in a series of informational sessions as part of our Division 512 or Melchior Lake Administrative Basin Rulemaking Outreach and Education. These sessions are optional. They're recorded and they're made available within a few days of each session on our Division 512 webpage. That webpage includes information about the rulemaking, meeting recordings, meeting agendas, meeting materials. So at any point during the rulemaking process, if you are curious or want to reflect on the work done thus far, you are welcome to go to that webpage and dive into those materials. Today is August 17th, 2023. We are covering voluntary agreements, and I am going to turn it over to our first presenter to go into the presentation.
That's me. Good morning, everybody. Ivan Gall with the Water Resources Department. So this morning, Tim and I have kind of broken this presentation up into two parts. I'll handle the first half dozen slides or so, and then Tim will take it from there. Our goal is to give folks an understanding of the kind of the framework and structure of voluntary agreements. And hopefully also an appreciation for this fact that the statutory language authorizing the use of voluntary agreements is fairly vague, which means there's opportunity for flexibility there. So let's get started. Next slide. So the first thing we wanted to do is kind of go through a table. Some of you may have seen this before. This is a summary of various regulatory control tools or management tools we have that can be used for groundwater across the state here. The first one is a withdrawal of unappropriated waters. That's not in scope for the Division 512 rulemaking. What this does is it withdraws unappropriated groundwater from future appropriation. So it's a forward-looking tool. It's only going to deal with future allocation there. The second one here is classification of water within a basin or part of a basin. This can classify or reclassify waters in an area of choice to the highest and best use, and also provide limitations on quantities of use for the future. Again, this tool is a forward-looking tool, so it's only going to look at future allocation of groundwater within whatever that boundary situation is there. The third tool here is a serious water management problem area, known as a SWAMPA with the acronym there. This is a fairly simple tool in that all it does is require measurement of groundwater use and reporting of data within some boundary area that's set up. What it does again is measuring present and future groundwater use in an aquifer system or part of an aquifer system where those data and information would be useful for water management purposes. The next one is a critical groundwater area designation. This is a tool that's different from the other ones in that it can actually impact or control existing groundwater uses. And that is, I think, everybody should understand the distinction there. The ones we've talked about so far were forward looking. This one can actually look backwards in time to permits that we've issued over the years and can control or curtail those groundwater uses in order to stabilize groundwater levels and protect the remaining groundwater for senior water right holders in the basin there. The last one here on this slide is the groundwater mitigation area. Again, it's not going to be applicable to the Division 512 rulemaking process. Right now, the only basin in the state that has this is the Deschutes Basin. The reason it was set up is to protect surface water flows, scenic waterway flows in the lower Deschutes River from future groundwater development. So in that particular example, if new groundwater rights are going to be issued within a large part of the Deschutes River Basin, the person applying for those groundwater rights has to come up with mitigation credits to offset the impact to the lower river scenic waterway flows there. Next slide, please. So a couple of other tools that are available for groundwater management. One is permit conditions. So many of the groundwater rights that have been issued over the last couple of decades contain one or more conditions as part of that water right that can limit groundwater use if certain conditions are met. And to simplify it down, generally, if groundwater levels in one or more of the applicant's wells, or perhaps a nearby or on-site observation well, drop more than 25 feet below a reference level, then groundwater use under that specific water right can be reduced or curtailed off until water levels recover up above that 25-foot threshold there. So again, those would be permit conditions in a subset of the groundwater rights that have been issued. Most of those permit conditions are in rights that have been issued over the last couple of decades. The last tool we'll talk about here is voluntary agreements, and that's really the focus of today's discussion. It's an agreement between groundwater users within the same groundwater reservoir system. And again, that is an opportunity to address current groundwater use going back over time to water rights that have been issued in the past, where groundwater users in a particular area or sub-area can work together to voluntarily reduce their groundwater use to meet some sort of a management target down the road. Next slide, please. So wanted to throw this one in here just to remind everybody of the timeline that we're on here for the Division 512 rulemaking process. We're going to be holding rule advisory committee meetings through probably January of 2024. If needed, if topics get more involved and we need more time, we can add additional RAC meetings to accommodate that. But right now, our schedule shows us wrapping up RAC meetings in January, early next year. Between February and June, the rules would be filed with the Secretary of State's office, and there'd be a public comment period. This allows the public to come in, comment on the rules in the formal public comment process there, and then the department would incorporate those comments in July of 2024 and move towards getting those draft rules in front of the commission for adoption at a proposed September 2024 commission meeting there. Next slide, please.
There is a question in the chat. I don't know how you guys are managing the questions. Just wanted to raise that.
Thanks, Laura. So we're probably, let's get through the content, and then we can have those conversations and questions after. But I'm tracking that, Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So starting to get into the nuts and bolts of voluntary agreements here, and then Tim will work us through the statutes. What is a voluntary agreement? So it's basically a tool, an opportunity, a methodology, contract, some mechanism, undefined, to reduce groundwater use in an area where groundwater levels are declining at a rate that something needs to be done to slow the rate of decline there. The authorizing statute is Oregon Revised Statute 537-745. Again, this is going to be an agreement among groundwater users. How many? All of them? Can one person enter into a voluntary agreement? Those questions are yet to be answered, and we'll look forward to some good discussions about that. The voluntary agreement has to meet the approval of the Water Resources Commission, and we'll talk about that here in more detail. And we wanted to note that it is a tool that really has not been used in Oregon to date to control groundwater. In the surface water world, we have things like rotation agreements where groups of surface water users voluntarily come together and work on mechanisms to try and get the most beneficial use out of a stream system. We have different management scenarios that have been set up around the state, water exchanges, things like that, but specific to 537, 745 and voluntary reductions in groundwater pumping, we really don't have any existing examples here in Oregon to point to. Next slide. So there are a couple of resources that have been worked on over the last couple of years. One of them is a review of Oregon's voluntary agreements statute for the Harney Community-Based Water Planning Collaborative. That was done by Culp and Kelly and the Environmental Defense Fund. So very helpful document there. They kind of scoured other similar types of arrangements in the West and helped provide some insight as to how other folks are using that. And then the Harney Technical Assistance for Oceans, Coasts, and Watersheds Projects, Groundwater Management in Oregon. This was a University of Oregon short publication, 4 pages there, and also can help provide some insight onto that. Next slide. So what work is currently going on? So we continue internally to have discussions about framing and scoping voluntary agreement work. We've had a lot of discussions about what would work, what wouldn't work, what does a voluntary agreement look like. None of that has been firmed up in any way, shape, or form. There was legislation passed this recent session here, which provided some resources to the department. It authorized a limited staff position, so either one person full-time for a year or one person half-time for a couple of years. There was some funding to assist the department with work that we'll need to do with the Department of Justice. Basically legal reviews of any rules we draft towards this effort, or alternatively, what are the basic specific requirements that a voluntary agreement would need to contain to meet the statutory requirements, which again are pretty vague. And then there's some what we call S&S dollars, services and supplies funding to support staffing on this. Next slide. Let's see, Tim, you're taking over here?
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to take over from here. My name is Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section. And so here we're going to start to really dig into what statutes say are required in a voluntary agreement, and then how we can start to move towards encouraging those voluntary agreements within the Harney Basin. So the first required element in a voluntary agreement is that it has to have content that is consistent with the intent, purposes, and requirements of, and then it points to essentially the Groundwater Act. And so that's ORS 537-505 to 795, and it includes 537-992. And so those are the state laws that govern groundwater in Oregon. And so then it says, but in particular, it should focus on these other statutes within the Groundwater Act. And so those are, first, the Groundwater Act policy. The second one is the critical groundwater area designations, rules, and filings, and then the powers of the Water Resources Commission. So any voluntary agreement needs to be consistent with the intent, purposes, and requirements of those statutes. So really it's saying we want to manage groundwater holistically in Oregon, and a voluntary agreement should fall in with that holistic management scheme. So if we go to the next slide. Additional content. So an example of how we put some of that content together or made rules where it was possible to have voluntary agreements previously, but we haven't had anyone enter into a voluntary agreement. Is in the Stage Gulch and the Butter Creek critical groundwater areas. So within those rules, we have provisions that outline a sustainable annual yield. And that's essentially how much water is allowed to be pumped during a period of time. And in those rules, we have provisions for how that water could be distributed with a voluntary agreement. And so groundwater users in sub areas within those critical groundwater areas have the ability to enter into voluntary agreements for distribution of the total amount of water that's allowed to be pumped in a year. So for the Harney Basin, we are updating our language to match with the statute. So it's no longer going to be called a sustainable annual yield. It's going to be called a permissible total withdrawal. So we're going to call it a PTW going forward, and we're really going to try to get that language right. And what we're committing to as the department is to provide that permissible total withdrawal by sub area within the Harney Basin, so that people will have a target that needs to be met for voluntary agreements. And so that's going to help to encourage voluntary agreements, because we'll have a set number we need to get to for curtailment, and people will have an understanding of what water will be available to be divided up amongst the groundwater users. And so that will form the basis of the content of voluntary agreement. So how that water is used, what the requirements are for each user that's going to use that water, rotations, etc. All of that would fall in content, and there's no requirements about how that should work. It simply has to, as I said previously, it has to meet the intent of the Groundwater Act and the statutes that go along with it. So that's the content piece, and that's what the department is going to help provide, is that those targets for allowable pumping, so permissible total withdrawal within each sub area within the basin. So we go to the next slide. The second piece is we have to have geography, right? So we have to, the statute says that the agreement must be entered into by users from the same groundwater reservoir. And so a groundwater reservoir means a designated body of standing or moving groundwater having exterior boundaries which may be ascertained or reasonably inferred. And the department's stance on this, and the way we've been designing things, is to have, because the Harney Basin is one entire groundwater reservoir, our intent from a management standpoint is to break that down into smaller sub areas, and users within sub areas would be considered members of the same groundwater reservoir for purposes of management. And so a voluntary agreement would need to be entered into by groundwater users within a sub area. So we don't need we are not intending that a voluntary agreement would have to be entered into by every user within Harney Basin. It would be within sub areas that will be defined as part of our rulemaking process. And so we're dealing with smaller subsets of people, hopefully making voluntary agreements more feasible. And those reductions would then be targeted on those specific areas based on the conditions in that area. And so for the Harney Basin, the department is going to work with the RAC, and we're going to define those sub areas and identify them throughout the basin so that we can then apply a permissible total withdrawal to each area. So now we've been able to pair who is involved, the geography of it, right? What groundwater users need to be involved in the voluntary agreement, along with the content. So what's allowable from a total pumpage. So then if we go to the next slide, Kelly.
Actually, I think we should pause real quick. We do
Yeah.
have some questions.
Sure.
But first, Mark, I want to see, you have any comments or?
Go ahead, off the chat. I can.
Okay, all right, so we do have a question on, so John, we'll answer that question at the end, but we do have a specific question about PTW. So that is, how does PTW relate to reasonably stable? So the department will be defining reasonably stable groundwater withdrawals for each sub area.
So
Let me add on to that, Tim, because I'm
Yeah.
gonna find out an answer. Sorry,
Yeah.
Kelly.
Please, go ahead.
Over the last several years, and I think it was 2 meetings ago, or maybe last meeting, when we had our first round. Ivan was talking about, potentially the department would come back in and give 3 different scenarios. First of all, we have to work through a community goal. What is the community desire in some of these areas? Do we want to reduce grade decline by X% over a period of time? Are we going to go right to as that exact number? My thought, and my understanding was, we would work with the community to figure out that goal. That goal would then produce 3 scenarios. The department would come back in. So in my mind, you're going to have potentially 3 potential
Permissible total withdrawals. Yeah, so PTW is gonna be a conversation. And a collaborative effort. That's gonna be based in the science and based on. The geology of the sub area as well as. The current water level trends. And reasonably stable is defined in rule. And the statute states essentially that the goal of the Groundwater Act, one of the policy goals of the department should be, and the commission should be, to maintain reasonably stable water levels. How that's defined, I think for the Harney Basin specifically in these sub areas will be a topic of conversation, and we'll need to understand what that, as you said, what is acceptable to the community and what is the community's goal, as well as we as the department have to represent the commission's view of what reasonably stable is as well. And so that's going to need to be a conversation between the department and the community in this rulemaking process as we get to a permissible total withdrawal. So does that answer the question?
Hi, everyone. This is Holly Mondo. I'm the one that asked that question. It does and doesn't. So I'm a little confused. Does permissible total withdrawal and reasonably stable, are we using those terms interchangeably, or are they 2 separate things?
But yeah, so I can address that directly. They're 2 separate things. Permissible total withdrawal is the total amount of groundwater pumping that will be allowed in an area per year. So that will be a number, most likely in acre feet.
Mhm.
And so that's how much water will be allowed to be pumped out of the ground. That will be based on our best scientific understanding to try to achieve reasonably stable groundwater levels.
Okay.
Right.
And to find what reasonably stable groundwater levels are, that conversation will be a collaborative conversation between the department, the commission, the Rules Advisory Committee. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, that makes much more sense. Thank you. And then one more question. Are the sub areas, I understand those haven't been identified just yet, but are you planning on identifying those sub areas based on, well, I guess what are you planning on basing those sub areas on? And are the reasonably stable levels going to be different for each sub area?
So those are 2 very good questions. The answer to the first question is at the next RAC meeting, which is August 29th. From what, 1 to 5?
1 to 5 here.
Here in this room or hybrid, we'll be discussing the criteria for defining sub areas. And so how we will define them will be based on a series of criteria, and we have proposals for how, what those criteria would be, but we want to talk with the community about what those criteria are and get feedback on those criteria before we actually start drawing lines on a map and presenting a map of sub areas. So that conversation is going to happen with the RAC on August 29th. So
What did you say?
29th,
Right, okay.
my wife's birthday.
Okay. At least the 25th, the person knows that.
No, it's the 29th, right?
Yes,
Then what time?
Yeah, thanks.
that's my daughter's birthday too.
It's a great day. So that's when we'll be having the conversation about sub areas. And I lost your second question. So can you repeat that, Holly?
Yeah, of course. My second question was, are there going to be different reasonably stable levels for each of those sub areas?
Different goals.
That's a really good question, and I think that's something that we should consider with the RAC.
Okay.
Because the geology in different sub areas is gonna be different. The impacts of changes to allowed pumpage are going to be different, and so we'll have to talk that through, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mark, do you want to add?
The only, appreciate the, still to be figured out exactly how we're gonna get there. I appreciate that. I also would say, you know, reasonably stable or community goals are probably gonna be different by different areas. Because there's some things in statute that you're not supposed to do, activity, but decline, stuff like that. We've already done that. We're exceedingly getting there faster in areas. So that might not be in my mind, the determining area. Determining area is in a period or temporal period of time, how we reduce the rate of decline and get to a new equilibrium. So I would just encourage you guys to do the free thinking and free thought before coming to the meeting.
Yeah, and let me jump in, and I'm gonna kind of, Tim, ask you a question. The definition of reasonably stable is part of an update to our groundwater allocation process. That's separate from groundwater management after we've allocated groundwater. And so there's nothing in, to my knowledge, the specific critical groundwater area statutes that are going to hold us to meeting the definition of reasonably stable through controlling groundwater use, so that there's flexibility in that sense. I would say that reasonably stable for allocation is probably a good goal to have for management long-term, but they're not necessarily the same things. And again, we should have some flexibility around that.
Sounded like a question that I would ask. Was there a question in that one?
Sorry, if you agree. Just any word and
I would agree with that.
Okay,
I think that was well said, yeah. Well asked.
So we have a question from Ken. Will the PTW be a range estimate or a point estimate?
That's a really good question.
Next question, please. I think, you know, I can take this,
Go
Tim.
for it.
I think to start the discussion, the groundwater section will provide a few points. If the PTW is this volume per year, we would expect the decline rate to slow from 10 feet per year to X feet per year. And so we can provide some bracketing data points based on the best available water level data and the best available water use data to try and help that conversation along. And I think very quickly folks will be like, well, wow, if we wanted to get down to a 0.5 foot per year decline, that's going to mean X% reduction in pumping. And that's what we need to lay on the table and start talking about. So
I think also from a rule standpoint, right, when we're talking specifically about writing this into rule, I think it's important that we all try to keep in mind that we need to get to a rule that provides certain amount of stability and assurances for users so that we're not constantly changing our targets or our allowable, like our permissible total withdrawal. And so people need to be able to know what to expect going forward from the rules. And so I shy away from a range estimate because that doesn't provide that level of like that understanding and that expectation
in the
rule that people can be. In the conversation, absolutely, it's going to have to be a range, and we're going to talk through that, like Ivan said. But when we get to a final rule, I think we need to have things laid out in a way that sets an expectation for the community of how things are going to work and what water is going to be allowed to be used.
So I'd agree to a point, Tim. I believe that we all desire to reduce the rate of decline. We all desire to make a difference, but it also has to be adaptive management. So right now, we're going to be producing these without the model that USGS is performing. The model will be very insightful, but the model also will need to be adapted from the change we make above ground to what's happening below ground. So I'm okay if we have a range, but we also have to put in a rule that we're going to reevaluate 5-year, 10-year, 2-year, 20-year, whatever it is, to give the community members and myself the comfort level that the range of numbers the department put out at first, which would equal this, are current. If they're not, we need to adjust. Maybe we can use more, maybe we can use less. But somehow there needs to be an adaptive management portion of the rule, so we're not tied in to our best guess without all the tools that we have.
And I think one of the things we talked about there, and it'll be an interesting discussion moving forward, are, you know, the use of representative wells and managing to different levels in the aquifer system. We may decide as a group that there's a hard bottom. Groundwater levels will not drop below this elevation. And there may be reasons for that, economic reasons, impacts to domestic wells, other parts of the conversation. And so we're trying to manage adaptively to make sure that water levels don't drop below that. And if they do, we should be clear what are the next steps that are going to have to occur to fix that. And again, we're probably not bringing groundwater levels back. We're trying to slow the decline. In an ideal world, stop the rate of decline. But you know, recovery really isn't on the table at this point in time.
And I don't know if there's an ideal world in a long time.
Yeah. So it's there's some hard conversations ahead, and I want to circle back to one of the things Mark said. One of the key components here, and the groups over the years have heard me talk about this, is time and timing. The sooner we start, the less painful it will be. But the rate at which we stop using groundwater or reduce our groundwater use is what's important to the producers that are out there. And so I think that's going to be a big component of the conversation. You know, how fast do we get to the end goal? It's really going to be key for the producers in the basin there. So,
And I'll say once again, I've said it before, this needs to be a generational glide path. This community needs time to adapt to what has happened. This community, for the services that we provide for the schools, the roads, the employment, needs a generational glide path to reinvent ourselves and move forward. I could go on more. But
generation of alfalfa or humans?
I got some alfalfa that's been 50 years, so we can go there if you want.
Old growth.
All right, so here's comments from Ken, so we're gonna get those, and we'll get to Holly, and then we'll move on with the PowerPoint slides, so.
I think, didn't we already address Holly's question?
Holly hasn't been, she had her hand first.
Oh,
Okay, so, Ken, do you want to unmute and like maybe expand upon your points, or do you want me to just read your comments? How do you want to
No,
do
they're just sarcastic comments.
that? Okay.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, Holly, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Sorry for all my questions. So in the case that some, folks don't want to enter into this voluntary agreement, what's the alternative for them? Are there repercussions for not opting into the voluntary agreement? Does that mean that regulation will occur? How does that coincide with a sub area voluntary agreement if there isn't full buy-in for it? I'm not saying I want that to happen. I'm all for voluntary agreements, but just trying to think about all the scenarios.
Can we put a pin in that and go through the next few slides?
Okay.
And then back to that question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
That was an extra transition, Holly. That was good.
So we talked about geography, where the agreements should be. We talked how that defines parties. So the parties to a voluntary agreement would be groundwater right holders by priority date for each, would be the groundwater users from the same groundwater reservoir, as I said. So what we're going to commit to providing to help facilitate voluntary agreements is a list of groundwater right holders by priority date for each sub area. And we'll provide that during the RAC process. So we have to have a conversation about criteria for sub areas, then we have to draw maps, have to agree on the maps, and then we'll be able to take the maps, figure out who the groundwater users are within each one of those areas and provide that to the community so that can help drive the voluntary agreement process. So we know who needs to be a part of a voluntary agreement in each area. So we go to the next slide. Process for approval. So this, once a voluntary agreement has been put together, a group of people come together, they say, we're all from the same groundwater reservoir, same sub area in this case. We've agreed on this content, we're gonna use this amount of water that matches with the permissible total withdrawal. Here's how we're gonna use it. Everyone signed on. They can then present this to the commission. And the statute says that when the commission finds that any such agreement executed in writing and filed with the commission is consistent with the intent, purposes, and requirements of Oregon's groundwater statutes, the commission shall approve the agreement. So essentially, the commission is then going to take a look at it and say, is this agreement meeting the intent of our management objectives in this sub area? And if so, they'll approve that agreement. And it really is that simple. The commission approves it. They'll make a determination. So if we go on to the next slide. Here's the process for termination. So the agreement may be terminated, and this is going to get into some of Holly's question as well. So once an agreement is approved by the commission, it's then going to control in lieu of an order. So the department and the commission do not have to issue an order to control groundwater. That voluntary agreement is going to be enforceable, and the department is going to help regulate that agreement. If at any time a lapse of time has occurred in the terms of the agreement, it can expire essentially. If the parties that consented to the agreement decide they no longer want to be a part of the agreement, they can end the agreement that way. Or if the commission finds that the users named in the agreement are not following the terms of the agreement, then the commission can issue an order overriding the agreement. And then we move on to management through critical groundwater area designation and an order of the commission to implement management through that process. So those are the three ways in which an agreement can be terminated. And the most forceful would be the commission deciding that the agreement is not meeting or is not being met. The agreement is not being followed by the groundwater users, or it is not meeting the objectives. So if the voluntary agreement is not meeting the permissible total withdrawal or is failing to achieve the intent of the groundwater statutes, then the commission can terminate it by order. So any questions there?
Yeah, we're gonna go, we have two, so I'm gonna start with Ken. Will the list include the permitted following for each well in each sub area?
The list will include the groundwater right holders and their priority date. So it would be their permitted uses. It would not be a permissible withdrawal, like permissible total withdrawal by well. This list is simply who has water rights, what are those water rights, and what are their priority dates.
And I think, yeah, I don't think, Ken, we would get to the per well limitation. We would do the limitation on a water right, and I would propose that would be the number of acres authorized and whether it's primary or supplemental, and 99% of them will be primary probably.
Okay, and anything to add there? Anything else to answer your question?
As close as it's going to.
Thanks. All right, Mark, go ahead.
Question, this might be a rabbit trail we don't want to go down. Is annual sustained yield, which will now be permissible total withdraw, something that normally can be contested through a contested case process?
So in order for permissible total withdrawal to be enforced as part of the critical groundwater area process and regulated on, the commission has to issue a draft order essentially. And then that draft order must go through a contested case process. And so it's actually kind of backwards. Normally a contested case comes from the end users. In this case, the commission has to essentially force a contested case by issuing a draft order, naming all the parties and moving to a contested case.
So if a group of users enters the volunteer agreement before a contested case or before that order is put out, are they then basically accepting that permissible total withdraw and actually leaking into themselves and they decide they want to go to this case?
That is a really good question, and I do not have the answer to that.
The
nor am
PT,
I,
the PTW is gonna be written into the rule, correct?
Yep.
Okay,
So that's gonna be memorialized in the rule before the contested case process. And the opportunity there would be through the draft report that the groundwater section will prepare for the commission and for the process. There will be a comment window for folks to look at the draft report and look at the PTWs and say that's not right, or we want flexibility there. Yeah, so I don't know. That would really be more of a legal question. If folks come into a voluntary agreement and start down that process, consent of the parties, they can step out of that agreement, you know, probably at any time. I think if the groundwater users wanted to back out of an agreement, voluntary agreement, I don't see the commission saying, well, we're not going to consent to that. That's probably not a likelihood. So I don't know. That would be a question for an attorney.
And I hope that doesn't go down, it just.
Right.
goes through my mind.
Yeah, that's certainly
That's a good
a
question.
good consideration.
So, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused this morning. So what you said was, if a voluntary agreement occurs, it's going to be before a critical groundwater designation.
No, they can happen in conjunction with each other. Voluntary agreement could happen after. the
okay.
critical groundwater
It just
designation.
sounded like when you said that, the voluntary agreement would be before, and then if people didn't,
It was phrased.
continue or agree with
Yeah,
it, continue with it, then it would be that.
Absolutely, I see
Okay.
that, yeah.
The second part of critical groundwater designation contested case
Right,
doesn't have to go forward if a volunteer agreement happens.
okay,
Correct,
So-
and we could go, like, it is feasible that we could go through a contested case
Yes.
process. We could issue an order to control, and all the groundwater users could get together and say, we don't want this to happen this way. We're gonna agree to this
right,
method, we're gonna meet the same PTW. Hand it to the commission, and the commission adopts it, that will control it, it will control in lieu of the order, so.
right.
The commission's order would still stand, but it would not be the controlling order, it would be a voluntary agreement that we follow.
Okay,
And so that's another way we could get there,
okay,
absolutely. In statute, there's no rules about when a voluntary
when it, yeah,
agreement
right,
can be
yeah,
entered
and that
into.
was my original understanding, you just.
I said it for you, absolutely.
No, that's fine.
Any other questions in the room?
Or online.
Yeah, but Ken, did we answer your question? Or did we answer your statement? Anything else you want to add to that?
It seems pretty straightforward, yes.
Okay,
I think the discussion really clarified that.
thanks, Ken. Great, let's go ahead and move on then.
All right, so now moving forward with voluntary agreements. So we as the department are going to continue to develop guidance, rules for voluntary agreements. We're going to consider rules in our rulemaking process. But right now, what we're trying to do is put as much guidance out there as we can to encourage voluntary agreements as soon as possible. Because the sooner we get to groundwater reductions, the better. In the Division 512 RAC, we're going to discuss PTW, we're going to discuss sub areas, and we're going to discuss any other items that we need to encourage voluntary agreements. The statute clearly says the department and the commission should encourage voluntary agreements, and we want to honor that and do our best here to come to collaborative solutions rather than to have to use the critical groundwater area designation. And then what we need from groundwater users is to begin identifying the scope, the interest, and the capacity for developing voluntary agreements locally. So figuring out what you can do as the community to begin entering into these voluntary agreements. And as we bring forward the information that you need, the parties who are involved, the areas, and the PTW, being ready to have those conversations with your neighbors about how that is going to work. And so that's how we move forward with voluntary agreements at this point. So I think that wraps up. Any additional questions? Mark?
Just thinking out loud, so At the first draft meeting, we also discussed, different areas of the basin are different stages of decline. Some areas of the basin require potentially faster action than others. When I look at this, I see PTWs and I see sub areas. Is the intent to make those 1 to 5 sub areas of the PTWs in rules for all 5 of those? They maybe have trigger points and when they would be enacted, or what's the intent? Or do we not know yet?
I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think the department's goal would be to establish the sub areas and rule for sure. We would then be able to provide lists of sub area groundwater users and get those out there so that folks knew, who's my groundwater pumping neighbor within my sub area and who could I be working with on a voluntary agreement. If we don't establish PTWs for each sub area during this rule process, we would have to come back and start that process over again. And it could certainly be a streamlined rule writing process. But, even a streamlined rule writing process is probably 6 to 9 months, depending on the content and staff availability and everything. And so I would say from an efficiency perspective, the department might lean towards establishing the sub areas and the PTWs for those sub areas in the rule process. The establishment of the PTW doesn't necessarily mean that, let's say there's 5 sub areas, doesn't necessarily mean that the contested case hearing process would move forward for all 5 sub areas at the same time. It might just be 1 sub area or 2. Again, lots of considerations to think about there as to what the plan would be. I guess I would also say that the PTW, again, based on best water level data, best water use data, might be the idealistic target for long-term management in a sub area, but it may not necessarily be the first target, even in the contested case hearing process. There may be, we've talked about sentinel wells, hard bottoms on groundwater elevations. All of those things can be used, I think, as other management objectives within a particular sub area there. Don't have specific answers, Mark, to all the questions, but from the department's perspective, we want this rulemaking to be complete, transparent, and relatively efficient because we have lots of other rulemakings that we have to do in the agency. So.
No, fair enough. And I'd be probably frustrated if you had answers for all those already.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna go to Ken. That was his first hand up, so Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like the conversation is really about how precise or how broad the sub areas are going to be. And if that's solely determined by the agency and that's presented to the RAC, what kind of conversation can you have when that dynamic is structured that way? Because then there will be embodied presumptions about what's a reasonable sub area, et cetera. And it seems like there's a broad range of discussion that could be had prior to defining those sub areas so that you could at least figure out what makes sense based on the science, but also what makes sense for the community. And, if you're going to do that internally, that's going to have a different dynamic than if you do it externally, is all I'm saying.
I would add on what Ken says, because as soon as those maps for that list becomes available, you've then chosen winners and losers within the community. You've then chosen, I don't have to work with them. I'm on this side of the line, thank goodness. So that I think has to be somewhat of a nebulous conversation as we design this.
Well, I suggest you join us on the afternoon of the 29th.
Perfect, 4 hours, we should be able to whip out all.
Don't miss that conversation. What we want to do is we want to talk about the criteria that we will propose and is open for discussion about how these sub areas will be selected. And then once the group and the department finalize the criteria, the rest of it's sort of going to be baked into the cake at that point. You're going to have criteria out there that we agree upon. Not all, we're not going to have full consensus, I'm sure. But after that, use of those criteria will be applied across the basin to establish the sub areas and the areas necessary. And then you'll have people on one side of the line and then people on the other side of the line. There's no question about it. But I think we'll find that by honoring the criteria, most folks are going to agree that that's the best we can do with establishing these sub area boundaries. And again, keep in mind, fundamentally, there are always winners and losers with water rights based on prior appropriation. That's just the way the system has been set up. So
It is, but also when people put in for water rights here, there was never an understanding that it would be divided up into smaller sub areas. So my prior appropriation dates would dramatically change by the sub area that I'm in.
yeah.
I mean, so that doesn't, it'll take our community a while to work through.
Yeah. And let's,
I thought I had one of the lowest rights. What do you mean you put me in the sub area? Now I have one of the junior rights. It'll just take a while for that
Yeah.
process to work out.
but let's make sure that part of that conversation, Mark, is, well, let's not have sub areas. Let's just go across the whole basin within the critical groundwater area boundary and regulate off the junior users. And the reason we wouldn't choose to go that path is that regulation of some of those juniors in the areas of very little decline isn't going to help.
So I agree there completely. I appreciate wanting to be adaptive and figuring out how we can.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'd phrase this all this.
Okay, Holly, and then John has a couple of questions. I'm gonna ask John. Go ahead, Holly.
Thank you. So, so the department plans on figuring out the sub areas based on certain criteria, establishing a critical groundwater management area, and then offering either regulation or voluntary agreement to get down to the reasonably stable levels for that sub area using the PTW for that sub area. If there are folks that do not want to enter into the voluntary agreement, how does the department plan to come in and regulate them? So what the scenario in my head is that the folks that are buying into the voluntary agreement are the ones that are doing all the work to establish the PTW, get down to reasonably stable, while other users who have not opted into the voluntary agreement are just continuing business as usual. So has the department thought about that at all? Because in the past, we've heard from the community that there have been mishaps with regulation in the basin. So I just want to be able to communicate to the community what would happen in the case that people don't buy into the voluntary agreement. Is it expected that those that do are the ones that are doing the work and the ones that don't just kind of get off scot-free? Or how is regulation going to occur? Is it like everybody has to do the voluntary agreement, or it's just all regulation?
Yes, so that's a really good question, Holly. And this is where we enter a gray area, and there isn't a lot of case law to help us. And Ivan, do you want to talk about is it Diamond Valley down in?
Yeah, I can touch on, I mean, the Diamond Valley example, and just specific to Oregon. Remember, the prior appropriation system has already set up, baked into it, winners and losers. So if you're a senior user in the sub area and you're focused on your bottom line and your business and your family's future, your business's future, there is zero incentive for those senior users to enter into a voluntary agreement. That's the reality of it. And my very vague understanding of the Diamond Valley case is that's what happened. The junior users, on the other hand, are strongly motivated to enter into voluntary agreements to do anything to maintain some ability to use groundwater use. And the best voluntary agreement is going to include all of the groundwater users in a sub area, and amongst themselves, they may try and more equitably distribute the water such that the juniors get a little or some, and the seniors maybe get more. Because everybody should recognize that the seniors don't have to enter into the voluntary agreement. That the department ultimately will end up protecting them and their interests. So I think, Holly, that's kind of the underlying framework that I certainly see today. And there will be lots of specific nuance and differences amongst sub-area users, neighbors. Hopefully the community wants to support the whole community, but it doesn't necessarily work out that way. Again, and let me just add too, it's not just regulation and voluntary agreements. We also have the CREP process, which is another off-ramp for folks to start reducing groundwater use, hopefully, with signups beginning as soon as this fall. But again, the goal is establishing relatively stable groundwater levels or much slower rates of decline in some of these sub areas. And if voluntary agreements help with that, then those folks in the voluntary agreement might be able to move forward with it. But if we don't get the stabilization that we need in those groundwater levels, hopefully through the contested case process, we'll put regulatory steps in place that would require further reduction in groundwater use, likely through the prior appropriation system. So junior users would be off first in totality, and then moving on up the priority date chain until we got stabilization in those water levels. So I hope that provides some answer to your question, and certainly happy to have a follow-up one.
Thanks, Ivan. Appreciate that. I have more.
Okay, you guys, I had the first question on this chain. Could somebody please address that before we're shut down?
Oh, we'll stay on as long as we need to, John, but yeah, we would, your question was next. So, Holly, you want to continue? You have a follow-up question?
Oh, no, that's okay. I'll jot them down and send them in an email.
Okay, thank you. All right, so John is asking you, please address the reality of drawdown condition regulation, especially in light of voluntary agreement.
Permitting conditions, so all with that periods.
So John, you're asking about enforcement of permit conditions in water rights, along with voluntary agreements.
Yeah, especially at this moment, I currently have Water Watch protesting 3 groundwater applications approved after re-review and everything. And one of their arguments is the drawdown condition is not regulated.
That's a good question. So I don't know the context of the protests out there, and I'm not going to speak to those, but maybe I'll flip your question around and kind of rephrase it. Would the department allow groundwater users who have triggered their drawdown conditions in their original permits to continue pumping groundwater under a voluntary agreement? And it's a good question. We have not discussed that internally to my knowledge, so I don't have an answer for you on that.
Well, then the main question would fall back. The main question would fall back to: are you guys regulating drawdown condition points when either permit or certificate holders hit that?
Not in the Harney Basin. We are doing it elsewhere in the state. We haven't started here yet. And right now, don't have the staff capacity to do so.
Of course.
John, anything else? Any other questions?
Nope. All done.
Okay. Thank you. Ken, do you want to elaborate on your comment? His comment was, isn't there a direct answer to Holly's question, which is if there is no voluntary agreement with the department, no voluntary agreement, the department can or will regulate by order?
Yes, yeah, that's correct, Ken.
But I think all your questions were nuanced.
But you get 90%, what do you do with the other 10%? And that's gonna be an interesting conversation, and more than likely it's gonna get litigated because of the volunteer agreement.
Yeah, because the statute is vague. It simply says among groundwater users from the same groundwater reservoir. It doesn't say among 90% or among 80%. It says among groundwater users. So
Justin Iverson back in 2017 in a meeting when we were first looking at volunteer agreements up in Northeast Oregon, said it'd have to be 100%. And we backed off of that and we learned from that too.
well, I feel like the Diamond Valley case was a good example of that, where the seniors didn't join in. And I can't remember what percentage it
Well,
was.
that was very unique. So Diamond Valley went through 2 periods of a lot of groundwater permits. In fact, some of the priority dates were only done by the state stamp of the envelope. So a lot of those were blocked up, I mean, within 3 weeks, 3 weeks.
Gotcha.
So there wasn't that hierarchy. The ones that protested, it was 2 senior water right users that were very old, that weren't actually part of the groundwater, and they didn't want to be issued. So it's a whole, it should read a study. It's very unique. Yeah.
Hey, Kelly. I'm gonna add for the people online, the Diamond Valley reference that everybody is using in the room, in case you haven't read the Environmental Defense Fund report. That's what they're referencing. So we've said it a couple times, but new folks who might be watching online or maybe aren't up to speed on that report should take a look at that. It's indicated in the earlier slides. Just want to flag that just in case we have new folks joining in.
Thanks, Alexander.
Any other questions or comments?
Or another actor, PTW. PTSD.
I know, that's what we always discuss.
Alexander, I'm gonna throw it over to you then now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, again, thank you folks for attending both in person here at the Harney County Community Center, folks online, asking your questions. Again, this is a learning opportunity for the community. It's a learning opportunity for us, the Water Resources Department, for the Rules Advisory Committee. These meetings are recorded. They're meant to, give us that starting point, build that foundation to have fruitful conversations. Our next Rules Advisory Committee meeting is August 29th here at the Harney County Community Center in Burns. I strongly suggest folks that are interested in the criteria around sub areas, please attend that meeting. Again, virtually or in person, it's a hybrid meeting. We also have one more informational session, and it's going to be around critical groundwater area designation. So those Division 10 rules that we've been so delightfully discussing over the last 6 or so months. I've given updates to the Harney Collaborative. I know there's a lot of interest from folks that attend those meetings. I'd strongly suggest you watch. We're going to do a pre-recorded, similar to what we did for our groundwater study informational session. So we're going to record a longer presentation for folks to digest the information and then come to that informational section with target questions that you would like to understand. If we start getting in the realm of something we're going to be discussing during the rulemaking, I'll ask we put a pin in it and we bring it to the August 29th meeting. But again, we want to try to build this foundational understanding because we know that these groundwater tools can be complex. We want to try to answer the questions so that we can have a fruitful conversation on August 29th and the subsequent RAC meetings to follow. So really appreciate you guys, and I'll jump over to Ivan real quick.
You want to mention the commission meeting at the end of September too?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to use the opportunity. So we are going to be bringing the Oregon Water Resources Commission to Burns. We're going to be having a Water Resources Commission meeting September 28th and 29th. So that's the last Thursday and Friday of September. And we are going to be having a lot of conversations around groundwater. We're going to be discussing this Division 512 rulemaking, the Division 10 rules, the groundwater allocation rules. So a lot of content that is really relevant to folks out here in Harney County. So if you're interested in attending that meeting, we'll have more information to come. I give monthly updates to the Harney Collaborative. Happy to answer any questions along the way with regards to that, but mark that on your calendars that the Oregon Water Resources Commission is coming here to Burns at the end of September. Thanks for the reminder item. Thank you guys for joining, and we'll hopefully see you next Thursday for the informational session on Division 10 rules. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks all.